Welcome, welcome. It's so wonderful to be here today with all of you and with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Esther Friedman. My name is Ziva Hassenfeld. I'm the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Assistant Professor of Jewish Education here at Brandeis University at the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education. And I'm really delighted to invite you all to a conversation between myself and Dr. Esther Friedman about her most recent research and publication, Gray Matters in Institutional Ideology: How Ideological Dilemmas Affect Orthodox Teachers in North American Community Schools. We will have a conversation and we invite everyone who is here with us to write questions as they come up, and I'll incorporate them into our conversation. Esther, how are you today?
I'm great, Ziva. Thank you so much for introducing me and for having me here with you today. It's always fun to talk to you.
Of course. So I'm going to jump in, and I'll just say from a personal perspective, I found this article really fascinating, both in its rigor and its methodology and its analysis of these semi-structured interviews, and also the topic that you tackle, which is the question of ideological diversity in Jewish day schools, something that we all have lived, but haven't really found a language to talk about. And so I want to ask, just how did you decide to take this? I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure everyone with us does, and maybe you'll surprise me. But what's the backstory of this project? How did you decide you want to study this topic? Tell us.
Okay, so as you alluded, this is a topic that's deeply autobiographical. I myself am an Orthodox woman. I've taught in multiple contexts in Jewish day schools. I've been a Bible Tanakh teacher. I taught in my own high school. And then I moved to a couple of other religious Orthodox all-girls high schools. And one of them was much more to the right of the high school that I went to and taught in. And one was much more to the left, but still Orthodox. And then after that, I moved into a community pluralistic setting. And in each of those experiences, I felt things, I experienced things, I had certain shifts in my own way of approaching the material to make it suitable to the audience that I was working with. And at the same time, I felt my own way of thinking start to evolve and shift as well. So it was a pedagogical shift as well as a personal shift. And then in 2014, I was at a Legacy Heritage Teacher Institute at the Hebrew University, and Professor Howie Deecher, who later became my doctoral advisor, he delivered the opening sort of conference session, and he introduced me to Michael Billig's Ideological Dilemmas, which I use as the conceptual framework for this article. And he spoke about how, I remember this was a slide, it said personal ideology, pedagogical ideology, and institutional ideology. And he spoke about how these three different levels of ideology can be in conflict with each other for an individual teacher. A teacher can have a personal belief about something, but they might have a different pedagogical belief. In other words, how they should be teaching this might be different than how they personally feel about the issue. And that can also be in conflict or in tension with the institution's belief about this issue or how this issue needs to be taught. Beyond that, so I sort of look at this sort of in a horizontal and a vertical way. There's also the intellectual ideology and the lived ideology. So that would mean the intellectual ideology would be in the institutional level, because that's what this article is about, what the school's mission is, what the school stands for. If you were going to read their brochure, what you were going to understand about this school or this institution. And then the lived ideology would be, on the ground, facts on the ground. What does it actually look like and feel like to be working in this institution? What does the ideology actually represent on the lived level? So that was the introduction. Obviously, this resonated with me very much because of my own experience. I had an opportunity to speak with him, and this eventually turned into this paper. And the question that I was interested in is, okay, so you have this teacher, that would be somebody like me, who's grappling with all of this tension, well, what happens to that teacher in that experience? And I remember he looked at me and said, oh, nobody's asked that question. So that was sort of the beginning of my journey. It took a while. I had to first finish my master's, get accepted into the PhD program. This paper is my Mapping the Field paper. It was the first study that I did. And I was looking to try to understand what types of tension Orthodox teachers in community schools experience. I was interested in their lived experience. So the research was very much done in that way. I asked them to describe the phenomenon as they experienced it. What do they understand pluralism to mean? How do they understand the school's enactment of pluralism? How do they understand pluralistic Tanakh teaching? And then what kinds of challenges do they encounter on all of these different levels? Why I wanted to do research on this phenomenon was because, as you said, research gives us language. And I was experiencing a phenomenon. I noticed others around me, but I didn't have a way to name what was happening. And the research gave me the ability to actually name that phenomenon. As human beings, we like to communicate our experiences, and research gives us the tools to be able to do that.
Great. So in a moment, we'll turn to sort of the meat of the research, which is your findings and the implications of your findings. But before we do that, because we are a research center, tell us more about your actual process. How did you decide the best way to tackle this phenomenon of teachers who are perhaps ideologically misaligned or perhaps in the end aligned with their institutions? How the best way to do this was through phenomenological interviews, 30 interviews. Tell us how all that happened.
Okay, so the first study, I mapped the fields with 10 teachers. I chose teachers who had worked in a community pluralistic school for at least 4 years, and they had to come from an Orthodox educational and religious background. I wanted people who had to grapple with something that was new and different. I interviewed them, and I guess the actual this semi-structured interview had like 3 phases to it. I talked to them sort of in general terms. What do you think about pluralism? What do you think the school thinks about pluralism? What do you think the school thinks about how Tanakh should be taught? And I asked them all of these questions sort of in a theoretical way. And then I gave them a piece of a text, and I asked them to talk about how they would address this text with their students. It was like a think aloud type of method. And then the third piece was I gave them a list of items that were taken from Inbar Galili Schechter's pedagogic hermeneutic orientations, and I asked them to choose which items they felt they resonated with them the most, or was most clearly related to the way that they operate. And her pedagogic hermeneutic orientations look at the teacher, the student, and the text, and each one's role in the classroom. And by doing this, I was able to find what I was looking for, which were the inconsistencies. So ideological dilemmas are inconsistencies, meaning it's not the dilemma of should I do this or should I do that. It's a different type of dilemma. It's an inconsistency that occurs between the lived and the intellectual ideology, or between 2 different lived ideologies or 2 different intellectual ideologies. So I wanted to pinpoint inconsistencies.
So hold on. I want to back up to method, and then but first, since we're on this, let me just ask, give us an example of an inconsistency.
Okay, so there were many examples, and they were exciting examples because people actually started yelling at me in the middle of the interviews. So I asked the teacher, do you believe that multiple viewpoints should be taught in the classroom, or only one, your viewpoint? And he basically said, I don't sugarcoat. I'm comfortable explaining. I have to speak the truth. And of course, I'm sensitive to my students, but I'm going to teach in an authentic manner, and I don't sugarcoat. Those were his words. Later, when I showed him this sort of controversial text, he actually started yelling at me. What's your problem? What's wrong with you? Why would you? Of course, I'm not going to teach this. Of course, if I was given a text like this, either I would refuse to teach it, or I'm going to dance around. And so he shifted his approach. Like, there was a very obvious difference between how he claimed, when I was talking in very hypothetical terms something that would be challenging, and how he actually responded when I showed him something challenging. That would be on the personal pedagogical level. On the institutional level, where I was able.
And can you tell us what the text was?
So it was a quote from Breshit, Ramban's introduction to Breshit, where he says that anybody who doesn't believe in God as creator has no connection to Torah whatsoever. That would be English translation. And so it sounds like what he's saying is that if you don't believe in God or God as creator, then you shouldn't be studying Torah. And that's not what he actually, I don't believe that's what he meant. I believe that he was
Ramban.
Pardon me?
You don't think that's what Ramban meant?
Right. I think he was talking about Aristotle.
Right. But this teacher was, so on the one hand, in the abstract, the teacher was saying, I'm gonna just tell it like it is. And then when you showed an actual text or an actual commentary where it said something that would alienate students in the school, the teacher said to you, I would not teach that. Is that what happened?
Yeah. And he basically was implying that I had a problem to even imply that such a text should be introduced into a classroom in a community school.
Fascinating.
Why would you even bring up something like that?
Fascinating. Okay. Yes. Hold on. I want to go back to method, and then we're going to go to the other categories. But just as far as, because I want to highlight, this is something that in learning about learning is important, that when we do research, we're operationalizing phenomenon in a rigorous and responsible way. And so we put a lot of, and the people we invite, you all put a lot of thought into your design. So it sounds like you had a sample, a very intentional sample, that was teachers who came from the Orthodox world, not including teachers who might have grown up in community schools themselves and then become more religious. Is that correct?
Yes, that was intentional.
So tell us a little bit more about that. And then the last methods question, then we'll get to the fun stuff. But I just want to highlight how the findings are only as good as the methods, and you have really good methods here. Tell us about the importance of doing these task-based elements of the interview. So it's not simply the teacher who's sharing abstract reflections, but you're actually requiring them to think through real tasks.
Okay. So just going back to the choice and how I, landed on this sample, which again, this is the beginning of studies that, there were more teachers involved in later studies, but this was the first one. It was really important that the teachers were exposed to things that would challenge them, not things that they had already grappled with. And the literature speaks about how belief change is something that is very difficult. People don't change their beliefs. People, they get beliefs early in life. They own those beliefs, and then they'll defend them. And it's very rare to see belief change in adulthood. So I didn't want somebody who had already gone through a transformation religiously, beliefs-wise. And that's why I had to exclude anybody who was not raised purely in an Orthodox background, had gone to Orthodox schools. That was the intentionality behind that decision. And because I chose a phenomenological approach, I'm not triangulating the data. Later on, I did. Later on, I interviewed teachers about their experience and their interactions with students. And then I also interviewed students to talk about, how they viewed those interactions. But for this particular study, I wanted to understand where those teachers felt the tension. So in order to have some type of validity, I'm relying on teacher reflection here. I'm asking them what they think, how they feel, which is legitimate, but I wanted to take more of an analytic phenomenological approach, not a pure phenomenology. And so I wanted to triangulate within the teacher reflection. In other words, I'm still asking them their opinion about the way they do things, but I'm asking the question 3 different ways so that I can see where I pinpoint the tension. If they self-contradict, it was a better chance of being able to locate those tensions and those inconsistencies in their own self-reporting.
Excellent. So you began to speak about the ideological dilemmas or ideological inconsistencies. So tell us more about that at a 30,000-foot level, what you learned through these particular interviews.
Okay. So again, this was the mapping the field, the first step, in a larger study where I ended up eventually landing on three larger areas of tension and then sort of funneling them down into very specific issues that come up in the classroom. But, this paper focused on the ideological level. That's why it's about institutional ideology. So on the level of the institution, there was an umbrella of findings that the institution's inconsistency between their lived and intellectual ideologies, between some of their intellectual ideologies, and between some of their lived ideologies created additional tension for this particular teacher population. Now, why am I saying additional tension? Well, Michael Kay, I think it was, argues that all teachers in pluralistic schools are going to be grappling with tension. If you're working in an environment where everybody's different and there's diverse viewpoints, diverse religious practices, nobody really fits in, so to speak. But people who belong to the broader community understand how those ideological dilemmas and inconsistencies work. This is a function of every society. Every society has ideological dilemmas built into it. But my argument was that the Orthodox teachers who are outsiders to this broader Jewish community, they're going to be more, so to speak, confused by these dilemmas because they don't live these dilemmas on a daily basis. And then I found that, so that was sort of a general why Orthodox teachers more than, because I've been challenged on this before.
Yes, you're being, by the way, there are questions about this in the chat, so excellent.
Good. Okay. So the question is, I could say this about anybody, and yes, I'm happy to, and it does apply beyond. I want to go beyond this. This was the sample I chose because this is what I know, and this is where I began. But in particular, I did find the Orthodox teachers experienced some things that maybe others wouldn't, or not to the same degree. So I had three major findings on the institutional level. One was to do with the way that the schools initiated these teachers into the schools. So many of the teachers that I interviewed, and even later on, it came up, not out of this study, but in my broader study, were another 25 teachers. They were hired by the school in a way that made them feel that they were very much desired by the school. They were chased, they were headhunted, they were begged. I tell some of these anecdotes in the article. And they come into the school feeling like, okay, the school wants me. This is what they want. And then, a week, a month, a year later, they're in the office getting in trouble. Getting called into the principal's office is never fun, no matter how old you are. And they're getting called into the office. You can't do it this way. This isn't acceptable. We've gotten 10 complaints about you. And they're thinking, well, you hired me. You knew I was going to teach it this way. Why are you so surprised? So I think that what's happening over there is that the schools have, needs. We all know about teacher pipeline issues, teacher shortages, teacher retention. So people are being hired, Orthodox teachers, oftentimes because they're subject matter experts. But nobody told them that they're being hired because they're subject matter experts and we're desperate for Tanakh teachers. They think, oh, look, I was headhunted. I'm being brought in because I'm the expert. And no one bothered to tell them or clarify that there were going to be some challenges. So then they're very much shocked and surprised later on when they face these types of challenges. So that was one. Another is that at no point did any teacher that I interviewed tell me, and this might not be true because I interviewed a total of 35 teachers, that they were actually told what the mission of the school is with regard to pluralism and how pluralistic Tanakh teaching looks. They might have been handed a binder. They might have been given curriculum to different degrees. Some of them were not, but they weren't, it wasn't explored. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't part of their new teacher induction. How to address, Bible studies in a pluralistic setting was not something that they were taught. And to the extreme that one of the teachers was hired to teach what he thought was history, and then it was Jewish history. And he told me that he didn't know Jewish history was a subject because he had gone to yeshiva and he never heard of the subject Jewish history. And the following year, they offered him a Tanakh class. So this is somebody with no background at all. He comes from a very different world without being trained into the actual study of the curriculum, the way the school wants it enacted. And third, again, with regard to on the institutional level, was there's a lot of curricular freedom that happens in Jewish day schools. Lots of people have written about this, not new. Teachers like having that autonomy. They like that freedom. But what they don't like so much is this feeling of, when am I going to get in trouble? Meaning, I have all this freedom. I can say what I want. I can teach it the way I want. Nissan and Shkady did a study in 2006. They did teachers of Israel and diaspora. When the teacher shuts the door of their classroom, they do whatever they want. This is in Israel with a ministry guiding how things are taught. But you shut the door of your class, you do what you want. So teachers really like that. They want to be able to teach the way they want to be able to teach. But what they don't like is this constant wondering, when is the shoe going to drop? When am I going to get called in? When am I going to get in trouble?
So tell us a little bit more about the ideological dilemmas or inconsistencies that you found.
So on the institutional level, when a teacher isn't really sure how the school enacts their pluralistic mission, I'll give you an example. A teacher told me that when she was hired, the one comment that was made to her was, this isn't, I'll quote it exactly, this school isn't an NCSY Shabbaton. And what they meant was, this school isn't an outreach organization. So you're coming from your background. I think this particular teacher was Chabad, and you're coming from a background of outreach. You're teaching, you're a religious Orthodox woman, and you're coming into a school where the students are not necessarily religiously observant. Don't have this mentality that the school is about your place, your playground to do outreach. And that was it. And then she comes into the school and she starts to see that, in fact, there is a lot of that sort of NCSY outreach flavor. Kids are invited for Shabbat dinner. There is a lot of this sort of outreach ruach energy in the building, and it wasn't really true. So she slowly but surely started to change. Like, she came in very respectful. I'm not going to do it this way. Similarly, I think it was the same teacher. The school talked about an openness to many different ways of, many different types of commentaries that can be used, a wide range of commentaries. So she taught some Hasidic commentaries and got called to task. So she felt like, well, I guess, the intellectual ideology of the school is multiple viewpoints, but there's a place where that line is drawn, and beyond that line, it's not really true. So what is the line? What are the parameters for these multiple views that are acceptable?
And I want to draw our attention to a quote that from your article, from the findings that you read about, and you touched on a little bit, but maybe we can unpack more. You write, quote, while teachers described experiences where students or even administrators were upset by things they said, they also describe a lack of clarity or direction around knowing what is allowed to be said and if and when, quote, something will blow up. They claim that there's just poor communication that's done about the validity of a perspective and what is a valid perspective, what isn't. It's a very, very dangerous and fine line for educators. And I'm going to take some of the energy coming from the questions from the audience and ask, is as far as pluralistic Jewish high schools, is this different than having Orthodox background or Orthodox theology? Is that create unique challenge different from, say, having particular Israel politics or having criticism of Israel politics in the context of a Jewish day school?
I'm going to say it's not exactly the same, but it's similar, because you're talking now more about political versus religious. But in terms of, diversity and diverse beliefs in a classroom and a teacher knowing how to navigate those differences, the word that kept coming up, that I coded for, was dangerous. It's sort of funny to think about a high school. I mean, high school is dangerous, I guess, in certain ways, but I always loved school, right? I was a good student, and I've been a student for most of my life. And whenever I wasn't being a student, I was being a teacher. And this talk of danger, and it's risky and it's dangerous, you don't expect to hear that word, but teachers spoke about being afraid to lose their jobs because of something that they said one day. And they really felt they weren't being given the guidance in a proactive way, but rather in a reactive way. And I don't think that's fair to teachers. And I would say that with the situation in Israel as well, it's not really fair to drop a teacher into a classroom and just expect them to know how they're supposed to address and what they're going to be backed by the administration for saying and what they might not be backed if they say. So that kind of clarity is really important for teachers to have. If you want me to keep talking about that, I could speak to why I don't think that's enough, and it's never going to be enough. But we can come back to that at the end.
Yeah, let's end there. When I asked you sort of like, what's the big implication of this? I just wanted to ask, as we're still sort of Lasok b'divrei Torah, your Torah, sort of immersed in the actual findings of this article, to ask what about dilemmas and conflicts they had, not with the administration, not with the school, but with themselves or with the material, sort of like the first story you opened with when the teacher said, yeah, I would never teach that.
Right. So that were part of the other two findings. That's a manuscript that's pretty much ready and about to be submitted. That's about authenticity. And of course, Mike Rosenak made famous the tension between authenticity and relevance. And these teachers experienced that as well. But there was one more piece to it, which was sensitivity, meaning I want to be authentic. I want to teach what I consider to be authentic Torah. To the Orthodox teachers, not a surprise, authentic equals the Orthodox approach. But I want to teach real Judaism, real authentic Torah, but I still have this tension because I need to be sensitive to my students. And another piece of that, which is similar, I built my dissertation on that finding and this next one. There was also the tension between their personal beliefs and what they thought should be taught. So I might personally believe, that this is the only truth, but I can't justifiably present that in a pluralistic classroom. So I'm going to, from a pedagogical standpoint, be open to teaching things that I don't agree with. Now, how they ended up navigating their way through that was an interesting array. There was a spectrum. There were teachers who openly engaged with different ideas because from a pedagogical point of view, they felt that was the correct way to approach the learning. Personally, they still had their own view. Other teachers, I call them the navigators. The first ones I call the engaged pluralists. The second ones I called the navigating pluralists. They would present many viewpoints, but there was always, an arrival, like a GPS. They arrived home, and home was back to their viewpoints. So they were very willing to present many views, but they had to land in one way or another. Other teachers, I call them avoidance navigators. So they would try very hard to avoid questions, avoid getting involved in issues that made them uncomfortable. But, when the student asked the question, they would allow the question in, they would answer the question, they would deal with it. They tried very hard. I mean, teachers went to great lengths to avoid challenging conversations, such as creating curriculum and like an elective course that avoids challenging issues. I mean, I feel like that's a pretty, another teacher told me about, there was a unit that she wasn't comfortable with, and she negotiated with the other teacher who was co-teaching to shove it all the way to the end of the year where she wouldn't have time and run out of time. And that would be the end of that. So I call those avoidance navigators. And then finally, I had excluders, people who just wouldn't allow questions in, wouldn't deal with it, wouldn't. So that's how they dealt with those other types of, but this particular article that we were talking about was dealing with those institutional challenges. Obviously, I go beyond that in my other research and beyond.
Great. So our last question, because if you can believe it, our time is almost done, is tell us why this research matters. What does it offer Jewish educators, Jewish leaders, teachers, etc.?
Okay. So obviously that is always the most important question to me. I'm a person who cares about things and cares about things that matter and cares about making sure that things matter. That's why I became a teacher, because I care about education. So, and there are times like right now where, you feel paralyzed by everything that's happening in the world. I was in the middle of my data collection for my dissertation when COVID hit. And I was like, why does anything I'm doing matter right now? Last year when AI was blowing up, I was like, does my research matter? I mean, there's so many bigger questions, bigger issues. And now with the war in Israel and anti-Semitism, you start to feel, does this research really matter right now when there are so many bigger things happening in the world? And then I stop myself and I say, wait a second, but this is really what it's about. I'm working to understand the teachers, and I'm also operationalizing a lot of these findings into professional development to find ways to help teachers learn how to navigate these difficult issues in the classroom. And on the one hand, it seems like there's an obvious solution. The school should be more transparent. The school should be more clear. Teachers should be inducted into the school's value system. They should be taught the parameters of what can be said and what can't be said. I don't believe that that's enough. I don't think that it's enough to tell teachers, because the world changes too quickly and there's new issues arising. I think that teachers need to be given the skills to navigate, so that whenever an issue arises and you don't know what that issue is going to be, new group of students, new class, new world crisis, you have the skills. And those skills are the skills that allow you to uncover student beliefs, to really engage in a dialogue with students, to not be afraid of finding out what your students think so that you can address those issues. And I also want to say that one of the most important things I learned, and I learned this from Miriam Rader-Roth, is about rupture and repair. A teacher needs to know, and this is, I think, something that you learn as a skill.
Yes.
You are going to make a mistake as an educator. You stand in front of a room and you talk all day, every day to a whole bunch of different people. You are going to offend somebody. It's unavoidable. But what you can learn is the skill of repairing the rupture. You can fix it. You can apologize. You can have a conversation. And that's what's more important almost than learning how to not make the mistake in the first place.
Esther, I love that. I just came back from a fabulous session on this in the context of sort of critiquing emotional learning and how it sort of teaches us to constantly turn the volume down, and said, like, let's not be afraid, exactly what you said, of rupture and repair. And it was pretty profound, growing up in a culture where we really are afraid, and rupture can be emotionally intense, but that it's not that we should do it every day, but that we can repair when it happens, and it can actually take us somewhere deeper. And I think that's an idea you're introducing in Jewish education that's really new, because we're very scared of rupture. And so we end up sort of avoiding, as you said, as one of the strategies. I also just want to say that, to wrap us up, that finding the value of your work is profoundly inspirational right now. And I'm doing work with these interviews with teachers in Israel who are saying exactly what you're saying. Like, if we don't keep working, if we don't keep believing that in education, in teaching, in improving teaching, then in some ways we are giving up. In some ways we are our best act of defense and defiance is to keep going. And so it's quite profound to have this discussion with you and to see your continued work, both in your current research and also in your fellowship with CASG right now, and your commitment to the classroom and to practice. And as always, you're a dear friend of mine, and I learned so much from you. So thank you so much for joining us. To everyone here, thank you for joining us at the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education with our Learning About Learning series. And we look forward to seeing you at our next one. Esther, thank you.
Thank you, Ziva. It was a pleasure talking to you as always.
As always. Take care, everyone.